myself with a game jam. So
Nice.
these are two paths that I've trekked. And I feel that they're, like you said, they are not necessarily mutually exclusive. I think they work well hand in hand. They've been really useful for me building up a brand and then building up an actual pipeline. Now, the problem with work for hire, and I'm going to specifically mention work for hire here, which is a model we've moved away from, and it's very common to find work that is white label.
Yep.
For those unfamiliar, white label work is essentially work that you can't say you've done, and you're not going to be on the credits or anything like that. You've been hired by a different studio to do these things, and ideally nobody will ever know. So how do you do these things, which are, maybe profitable, maybe not that much? How do you do these projects and still build a credibility, to me, is the part where it becomes difficult. I think there's a consensus, though, that in the market right now, there's less work for hire than it used to be. It's not necessarily a dying model, but it's certainly not a very hyped one, I would say. So the question is, what does actually happen in the industry right now? And we're seeing more and more co-development. And it's a very catch-all term that does mean a number of different things. From licensing deals with, publishers that say, hey, do you want to do the next Resident Evil game? That's not going to happen, but, all the way down to, you're going to do all of the art with your studio, and we're going to do all of the programming with our studio. We're not going to exchange any money, but at the end, both of us are going to get 50-50 split on the revenue. So that's like the let's share all of the risks. Mm-hmm. And there's a wide area of things that you can explore there, but I would say it's about having an open mind and figuring out a path for your team based on your strengths, and then building the technology in parallel if you can, or not necessarily just the technology, but acquiring the resources to actually get to your end goal. One of the things, for example, we did for a long time, we were a tech shop on the Cathar games end. So most of us, we're programmers, and right now we're transitioning where we have critical mass and we have the projects that allow us to finally recruit more on the creative side of things. So think artist level design and stuff like that. We had to grow the studio to a certain size before we could incorporate these individuals without increasing the risks too much,
Yeah.
So that's the production part of things, I would say.
Okay. And I think that's really interesting, too, because as you were explaining things there, too, because I'm sure some listeners might be like, oh, well, maybe I should go this way, or wait, or this way might be better. But ultimately, your point is simply, finding a solution or whatever that works best for your team and then adapting from that. Because you just gave like 3 scenarios that you had from personal experience, but over time, they've all changed and everything, because of course they're going to change in time as like you grow and you learn and everything else and which models, and I'm sure it was never an easy thing. Like you said, it's not like these decisions aren't passive or anything like that. And it comes certain points of times you need to make, those executive calls, but it's still, it's an ongoing thing that's always going to be changing. So no, any of the solutions you expressed here aren't necessarily the one that you have to follow, or I have to follow in this, like, little role-playing session here. But it's just to say that, just be aware that there's multiple ways to go around this, correct?
As a business strategy person, I would say one of the things that's very important is every month or so, picking maybe at least half a day to just sketch the landscape. What is our business? Are you familiar with the concept of SWOT?
SWOT?
SWOT, yeah.
Yep.
Okay, so but just in the interest of anybody listening, the SWOT is this business strategy. Essentially, it's a very simple thing that you can do where you establish what your strengths are, your weaknesses, the threats, and the opportunities for anything that's happening in the market right now. So it helps you position who you are, what your team is about, what it can and can't do well, and what's in the market, what can and can't be done. And based on observation, so because you don't have like a report, well, you probably can get that, but I'm not sure I would trust this. But like, it's not something they're going to build from a report of the industry and whatnot. It will be based on personal experience. We've talked with these individuals. This is what they were looking for. This is what we were looking for. We're not meshing all that well together. So what's a good partnership that can happen with what we can do and what they're looking for? Or the fact that we were building stuff in a certain way and the market is closing, we need to move away from that. So I think every month is not necessarily a bad thing to just have a sit down with yourself, and draw things. I really like sketching it on paper so it makes sense. Alternatively, you could use other tools, but I really like the idea of just picturing as you grow, as the studio evolves, just where are we along that trail of where we wanted to go? Has that objective changed? And what are we missing? And what's the next logical step that we need to build out? And how do we go about building it? So like I said, we knew that we were missing creative folks. So we need more level design and more artists. How do we fit them in? What's the opportunity for them to come in? How can we use them at first, even though we're not necessarily working on the full title yet? So yeah, it's about being responsive to the changes. Like I said, there's no set of questions that I want to ask everybody that comes to me.
Right.
There's no set order of things to happen. I think a startup, a new studio, is essentially a matter of listening to what's happening and seeing how you fit in the bigger picture, and evolving from there. We've seen tons of studio dies, and so far so good. So we're trying to adjust to that.
Nice.
No, it takes a lot of insight. So
yeah.
On that particular file, we just say, go to trade shows when, there's no virus closing them down. Just so you can hear other people's thoughts, and it really helps.
Yeah, totally. So again, some really great insight. And I think what you just shared with us there too was just like, still being adaptive to everything and introspective too, and taking those moments to really, like you said, picture and even write out, well, like on a monthly basis, because I think that's really good at identifying your goals and at a higher level, not just what your goals are, but are you still on the path to achieving them? And if for whatever reason something comes up, then it's important to like maybe pivot a little bit or change that or make sure that you're getting back on course. So I think that's a lot of good stuff in there. Now, we talked a little bit about scaling, and we don't need to go too much in depth with this, but in terms of scaling, and let's say you're making that project and then you're hitting milestones, but then at a certain point you realize you're not able to hit everything because you do need to grow a little bit. Maybe you need some funding, or maybe you're finally at that point where like, hey, look, we're still super focused on the development here, but we're eventually going to be approaching, launching the game, and maybe seeking some type of representation is going to be helpful. How can these things that we just talked about and these insights and everything be really good and helpful in terms of preparing for those next steps when funding is going to be essential, or having some type of partnership that is going to take care of everything else beyond and like up to like launch and everything?
So scaling is a very hairy question. There's an extent to which there's science, and then there's an extent to which there's preference. My personal preference, and I think it is more preference than science, is I like to keep a tight team, very, very small outfit. I keep saying to my guys that we're never going to be bigger than 22, most likely. Keep it very light and figure out vendors, outsourcing partners that you can work with on a recurring basis, people that you come to trust. You test them on one project, then you want them on the next one and the next one and the next one. And as long as our interests align, it can be a very fruitful relationship. Because one of the examples that I took, because I was talking about this recently, our team is never going to be cost efficient with the market for art production, for example. Mm-hmm. So we can certainly establish a creative vision, an artistic vision for a project. We can certainly set a vertical slice together. But when we end up into production, we need to partner up. There is just no reason why we would not, because our team is digitally distributed. We can work with anybody. All we need to do is find somebody that we trust. And that's the problem. You don't trust people from just the one project. It needs to be a recurring thing. So I would say very early on, if you can integrate other parties, and that's why I'm talking about partnerships all the time. Mm-hmm. I think it's a very helpful thing, because ultimately the indie bubble, well, maybe the closing indie bubble we're in, can only survive through helping each other out, I think. And this happens chiefly by working with other studios that have particular strength. We talked about SWOT. I think it's very important because you have certain strengths and other studios have other strengths. And instead of trying to build new strengths within your studio, which is going to dilute your strengths, it's probably best to look at other teams and say, look, your prices are better, your artistic skills are better, it would make a lot more sense that we work together on this. Um, and and it's something that we've done a lot. I think it's probably, and like I said, this is preference, but that's the way I look at scaling. I
Mm,
try to keep a smaller team. It's also a question of risk assessment or risk management, if you will, where if things don't go the way that we had planned, we can just close these relationships and turn it inwards and fix everything, and it's not going to be as damaging as if we had to go through layoffs. I've been through my share of layoffs in the past, and it's not something that I really want to live through again. So it's probably part of why this is my preference.
mm.
I don't want to stare somebody down and say, I have to let you go. So
Right.
part of that, I guess. But I think there's a lot of value as well to just working. And you mentioned something, beyond just the development side. Um, One of the things that I keep saying, to our clients and whatnot is I'm very good. We're collectively very good, but also as a consultant, I'm very good with everything that's concerning, you have an idea in your head. We're going to transpose that through, pre-production, production, get you funded, everything. I'm not the guy you want, and we're not the team you want post that.
Mm,
Some people are much better, geared or equipped to deal with that, the marketing aspect, post launch and everything, content updates. Somebody's much more, geared towards that side of the industry, and it would make no sense for me to dilute what we do in favor of doing that as well. Like trying to do too much would just dilute the value we bring. And so I don't know that it answers the question necessarily, but my reflex would be to that's typically where I would lead into publishers. I would lead into external parties that can handle PR, marketing if I wanted to self-publish, and so on and so forth. Um, yeah.
Yeah, well, but still, I think that like everything that we've talked about up to that point too, like having that vision and knowing what your strengths are and things like that. If anything, a lot of those are probably going to be really helpful in terms of, well, you might not be necessarily from your consulting sides be the one to help facilitate it or whatever, but at least that value that you provide and that insight is really going to be helpful. So it puts whatever that team is, like my indie studio we're talking about here potentially, it puts us in a position where we can then on our own accord, or whether we seek additional help, let's say having a meeting with a publisher, like because we have a good team in place, a good strategy, we're very risk adverse and things like that. It might make that process a little bit easier based off of all pretty much this foundational stuff that we were talking about earlier. Would you say that's pretty fair? Opposed to someone else who's just like, oh, hey, I made this game and what do you think? Can you give me money now? Not that it's that simply put, but still.
Yeah, I mean, if I'm understanding what you're saying, basically you're saying that the awareness of everything that's around is going to come in handy, and if that's your stance on it, I would say I have to agree. But there's a distance between being aware of certain things, having gone through them, and then being the expert. And
Right.
so that's when I say strengths and weaknesses is what I mean. You can be weak at something, but the fact that you know about it could be a strength. So, for example, I'm very bad when it comes to marketing, but the fact that I've been through the process of bringing games over to publishers, delivering games, over maybe 100 times at this point,
Mm.
is a strength because it's actually part of the reason why I mentioned that you should probably start with a game jam is because the experience of completing a cycle, it's something that I thought was really interesting. It's a parallel between AAA and indie games.
Mm.
Completing a AAA game and completing an indie game are a bit different, but for the most part, a lot of the same steps happen. So if you're going to compare an indie developer that's developed 10 games to it in the same time span a AAA game, a studio might have developed just the one, there are certain skills that an indie studio might actually be better at in terms of bringing a game to market simply because they can do it faster, can do more of that. And I think that's super valuable. Because then you learn a lot about these things. So what we're just saying is like, I don't know much about marketing, but if I was in a AAA studio and we had never shipped a game, I would know nothing about marketing. So there's a difference there.
Yeah.
And when we're talking about I guess we could probably segue into just the whole publisher relationship or just the whole funding, because I don't.